Big news in Latter-day Saint church history because for the first time ever, the church has acknowledged and published a controversial revelation from the prophet John Taylor that some have argued means that polygamy should have never ended. If this revelation is truly legitimate and is a real revelation from a prophet of God, people have wondered, why would the church discontinue polygamy? And even more so, why would it deny the existence of this very revelation? And that is what we are going to be explaining today. In 1886, the prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, John Taylor, was in hiding from federal agents because the government had recently outlawed cohabitating with more than one woman, aka this was in response to the church's practice of plural marriage. While in hiding, John Taylor authored a revelation which begins with the prophetic weight of the phrase, "Thus saith the Lord," and then proceeds to explain how the new and everlasting covenant stands forever. It cannot be done away except by God's authority, and God even says, "I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting." So, very bold words with broad implications. Fundamentalist Mormons have pointed to this revelation as evidence that polygamy should continue, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is in apostasy because God never revoked this law. Critics of the church and historians have pointed to this revelation as evidence that the church lied about its history because it didn't publicly acknowledge this revelation's existence or authenticity until very recently. These are valid concerns because, you heard the words yourself. This revelation is pretty bold about never revoking God's law. However, the reality behind all of these concerns is more complex. For one, the revelation may not even be referring to plural marriage at all. The revelation never specifies that polygamy is not what will be revoked. It says that the new and everlasting covenant will not be revoked, which is much broader than polygamy or marriage in general. It encapsulates every covenant that God has ever made with man. So while a fundamentalist might point to this revelation to validate their practice of plural marriage, I think the revelation is up to interpretation and far less straightforward than being presented. But what a lot of people find interesting and concerning about this whole thing is the church's reception of this revelation and whether or not they lied about it. And I think that the key to understanding how to interpret the revelation's reception is all in the timing and context of this revelation. When John Taylor received this revelation, he never presented it to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles or the church to canonize it. In fact, this document wasn't even known during John Taylor's lifetime. His son discovered the revelation after his father's death among his papers, and church leaders didn't even learn of it until several years after that, when John Taylor's son informed the rest of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles about his father's revelation. So it hardly seems like a document that John Taylor was eager to circulate church-wide and to be church-binding. Just a week after the apostles became aware of John Taylor's revelation, President Wilford Woodruff issued the Manifesto, formally discontinuing the practice of polygamy. And then 20 years after that, in 1909, Joseph Fielding Smith made a copy of John Taylor's revelation for the church historian's office. So the church was aware of the existence of the document, yet still held that it was God's will to discontinue plural marriage. But what we have to keep in mind here is that in contrast to the John Taylor revelation being received in isolation, the manifesto was presented to and sustained by the entire body of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and sustained by the church membership, making it authoritative and binding on the whole church. But even still, the church was pretty resistant to acknowledging this revelation. And you have to keep in mind the context of John Taylor's son, because he continued to practice polygamy. He insisted on it against church teachings. He ended up getting excommunicated. And then other fundamentalists began circulating this revelation, creating quite the air of confusion among the membership. And so that is when the church made an official statement in 1933 that seems a little shocking. In 1933, the church emphatically stated, "As to this pretended revelation, it should be said that the archives of the church contain no such revelation. The archives contain no record of any such revelation, nor any evidence justifying a belief that any such revelation was ever given. No such revelation exists." Considering that we just talked about how several church leaders did know of this revelation, and there even was a copy of it in the church historian's office, this seems a little contrary to reality. So what is this? Is this the church lying to cover up a revelation from one of their own prophets because it seems to contradict the canonized manifesto? Certainly, like I said, the church had resistance to circulating this revelation, not wanting to create more confusion with the manifesto, but I think there's more than meets the eye here when it comes to the wording of the statement. Instead of being overtly dishonest, it seems like this was left intentionally vague. As far as having the document in the archives, they did have a copy of this revelation in the church historian's office, but this wasn't technically the church's official archives, and they did not obtain the original document until a month later. As far as denying that this revelation exists, they never denied the existence of the document in this statement, just The revelation, and that's the key part here. The reality is that several church leaders were highly skeptical that this document was authentic, given the circumstances in which it came about, and John Taylor's sons' growing apostasy against the church. They knew of the document, but they didn't necessarily believe that it was a bona fide revelation, so they didn't have a knowledge of the revelation. And to be fair to the church, it was not until the end of the 20th century and into the 2000s that historians began to certify the authenticity of this revelation as being in John Taylor's for sure handwriting and legitimate. So in 2020, the church's official history saints included a reference to this revelation. And this week, the church officially digitized it in their online catalog for public consumption. So the church has been providing access to this document as the best information has become available. I get it. It can be uncomfortable to think about church leaders obscuring the existence of a revelation when the stakes are so high. I mean, this is potentially a revelation from God from a prophet. But I think that's actually part of what helps to contextualize this. The stakes were very high. Post-manifesto, the church was in a very challenging position of trying to live their religion in peace while also trying to obey the laws of the land and also trying to distinguish themselves from fundamentalist Mormons who were no longer affiliated with the church. And in the face of intense government scrutiny and apostatizing church membership, being skeptical of a sensational document is understandable, even if ultimately mistaken. But even acknowledging that this historical document is legitimate, it doesn't make it binding on the church because it was never presented to and accepted by the church leaders. And unlike revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, because it was never canonized, this revelation does not hold doctrinal weight. And I think it's also telling that the revelation never explicitly contradicts revealed doctrine, as God's new and everlasting covenant is everlasting. It will not be revoked. But that doesn't mean that the practice of plural marriage can't ever be discontinued. God's whole goal is to draw humanity unto him by covenanting with man and forging an unbreakable relationship. This covenant began with Adam and continued on through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the saints of the latter days. So is the John Taylor revelation legitimately from John Taylor? Yes, historians have showed that. Does it contradict our doctrine? I don't think so. Is it binding on the church? No. Was the church reluctant to have this revelation circulated? Yes. Were they justified in denying its authenticity? Clearly, historians have shown that this was legitimate, and so the church was mistaken in that, but the reality is, history is messy. And sometimes the church struggles to navigate its history, just like any historian does. But I am so grateful the church really does invest so much in its history by working with top-notch historians to make sure our stories are being told responsibly and well. As better information has become available, the church has adapted, and thanks to church historians and church leaders, this document is now freely available online for anyone to read and study. To dive into the history and context of this revelation for yourself, check out this fantastic article at Mormoner.org.